because it's something that I've actually never done before. I've never spoken about a personality and an isolated class on an individual. And I think there's no better individual to start with than Maimonides. And you ask me, Rabbi, Maimonides died more than 800 years ago. Why is it so significant? Why is it important to spend an hour and 25 minutes to talk about him, what he meant, and give a little flavor of his life and his impact and his influence on Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy and Jewish learning? So that's, I think, a very legitimate question. Why is it important? What do we gain to have this discussion? So I wrote down 3 reasons why I think it's important for us. I'm sure there's more reasons as well. But number one, in our classes till now, we've talked a lot about Maimonides. We've quoted him multiple times. We dealt a lot with Jewish philosophy, Jewish life and practice, and there's no way to talk about those things and do it justice if you're not going to mention Maimonides multiple times. So we already know a lot about him, and we already hear a lot about him, but I want to give maybe a coherent, cogent insight onto who he was and what is his significance. So we talked about him. Let's talk about him further. Number 2, I think even though Maimonides died many hundreds of years ago, his influence and especially his literary accomplishments are still as relevant today as they ever were. Right? Case in point, the works of Maimonides till this day spawn hundreds of books a year written on Maimonides. There's hundreds of books every single year that are written on Maimonides and his works. So even though this is someone who died hundreds of years ago, his works and his life and his impact is still very much felt today. So I don't think it's an ancient topic. I think it's much more of a dynamic and ongoing topic, as we'll see why. And the last reason why I think it's important to learn about his life and his place in the path, so to speak, of transmitting Torah is because we'll learn a lot about Torah itself when we talk about Maimonides' contribution to Torah. So we're going to talk more about his influence and his writings than we will his life. We'll also try to give a little bit of a flavor of his life and what he actually went through. How's that sound? We're excited?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Okay, let's go. So Maimonides was born in 1135 in Cordova in Spain. Spain had the Middle Ages. It was the golden age of Spain. Jewish people had a wonderful time for about 400 years. There was a vibrant Jewish community in Spain, and that kind of ended with Maimonides. He kind of marks the zenith, and it was all downhill from there. His father was a distinguished rabbi. His father was he considers him to be his teacher, his primary teacher. He was a descendant of King David, the royal family of the Jewish people. And Maimonides, from a young age, exhibited tremendous intellectual capabilities, superb intellect, a photographic mind, and intense willpower to sit and study. And at the age of 15, he writes about himself that he had already accomplished a complete education in all areas of scholarship, holy, Torah, and secular.
15?
At the age of 15.
That's astonishing.
That's astonishing, yes. When we say all areas of knowledge, obviously we're talking about Torah, but we're talking about also mathematics. We're talking about astronomy. Maimonides has tremendously detailed writings of astronomy, and even built upon obviously models that are still true today. Jewish astronomy is built on the fact that the Earth is a sphere. We knew that way thousands of years ago, way before everyone else did.
So not Ptolemaic.
No. Where the Torah, and also we have things in the Torah right that like only now, like NASA's coming across them. Like the exact length of a lunar moon, for example. Like it's written in the Talmud. The Talmud says how long of a lunar moon, of a lunar month. How long does it take? Down to the second. We have those things in detail. So at the age of 15, a chaotic upheaval happened to Maimonides as an individual, but also to the entire Spanish Jewry. There was a group of Islamic fanatics called the Almohads, And they stage an upheaval in Spain. And with Islam, we know that they're constantly vacillating between moderates and fanatics. Right? There are some Islamics over history that have taken the Quran very seriously and very literally. And doing that equals fanaticism and oftentimes cruelty. And there's no cruelty that equals the cruelty perpetrated in the name of God, because then there's no inhibitions. So what was a moderate Islamic caliphate became a extremist in the year 1150. They had a coup and they won, and they gave the Jews an ultimatum. They said, either convert to Islam or you leave. And we know this is an example that we see multiple times in history. The vast majority of Jews chose exile, as did Maimonides' family. Many Jews converted, but they converted only as a facade or as a ruse. And then years later, when the tide changed, they tried to come back, and there was a whole controversy. You would let them back. These are traitors, so to speak. They converted to Islam, but now you don't want to come back to being Jews. But the vast majority of them did convert back or return back to Jewry out in the open, and Maimonides was instrumental in assuring that.
Either question about whether Maimonides converted to.
Well, there's a debate about that. That's true. There is a debate about that, but according to tradition, according to the story, he didn't, because they left. Well, they actually went first. They went to Fez. Fez is in Morocco, North Africa. And so, at the age of 15, Maimonides and his family went to Morocco to escape the Almohads, which is the reason why it's safe to say that they didn't convert, because why would they? Now, they went to Morocco, and unfortunately, they didn't go far enough. This is an example that we see again in the times of, the Holocaust. A lot of German Jews has weird escaping the Nazis, and they escaped, but they didn't quite go far enough. They went to Belgium, went to France, or someplace that was eventually conquered by the Nazis. Didn't quite escape them. Maimonides also as well. He went to him and his family. He's only 15 years old. Him and his family went to Morocco in Fez, and very soon afterwards there was an additional revolution, and the Almohads again took control. And Maimonides and his family, they ended up spending between 7 and 9 years living in caves in the Atlas Mountains in North Africa. So this gives us some kind of a picture of somewhat of a chaos that would occur in Maimonides' life. We'll see this as an ongoing theme. And at the age of 15, and for us, we think, okay, you move from Spain to Morocco. It's not so far on the map. But in ancient times, where travel was very precarious, was very dangerous, Maimonides himself had a phobia for travel. His brother, we'll see later on, hopefully, but he had only one brother, was a renowned businessman, a merchant, who was also supported financially with the Maimonides, but he was lost at sea. So we'll see later on that he wrote a letter, and he had some sort of a phobia from these dangerous travels that people take even just across the Mediterranean, because he himself had tragedy with his own brother dying at sea. Either way, Maimonides spent 9 years, between 7 and 9 years, in the Atlas Mountains, in a cave, and there is where he wrote the first of his 3 major literary accomplishments. Any one of these 3 literary accomplishments would have guaranteed Maimonides immortality. Any one of them. Because any one of them, their scope and the magnitude and the impact and the influence of the work was so enormous and so groundbreaking that just one of those 3 would have been beyond the capacity of most people today even to study. But to author, it's mind-boggling. And Maimonides had 3 of these. 3 massive, groundbreaking, revolutionary works. The first one he wrote as a teenager in the caves in Morocco. And this was his commentary on the Mishnah. Pirush HaMishnah. Commentary on the Mishnah. This was the first commentary written on the Mishnah, on the entire Mishnah. 63 books of the Mishnah. A commentary from beginning to end with multiple introductions. And we'll see more about that. We'll see more about what just in a second. Just hang on for that. Hang on to that thought of the introductions. This commentary in the Mishnah was very unique. First of all, it was the first one of its kind. The Mishnah was written about 1,000 years earlier. No one had succeeded in writing a commentary in all 63 books of the Mishnah. No one had done it. And Maimonides, as a teenager, did it. And in this, and he did things that were never done before. He was very innovative. For example, he wrote it in Arabic. And he wrote it in Arabic because his intention was that it should be ready and available for everyone. That was the common language spoken. And therefore, he wanted everyone to read it, to access it. He had a vision for what this was going to accomplish. This was going to make the Mishnah very accessible, right? For everyone. And therefore, he wanted it to be written in the vernacular that people are familiar with. So he wrote it in Arabic, but he didn't write in Arabic letters. Interestingly, he wrote in Hebrew alphabet with the Hebrew script with the Arabic language.
Transliteration.
Yeah, well, like what Yiddish eventually became the same thing. Yiddish became its own language, but it was written eventually. It was a Hebraicized German, but it was written eventually in Hebrew letters.
In Spain, what were they speaking in Cordoba, Spain?
I assume it was some sort of Spanish or Arabic or Ladino. Ladino was like in a Hebraicized mixture of Spanish and Arabic. This is a common thing. There are some that are arguing that it's happening today with English. That there's already some words that.
English.
Yeah, well, no. There's Yiddish words. That Yiddish words are Hebrew or Jewish words. It means that we're Jewifying our languages. We have with Ladino. We have obviously with Yiddish and German. And over hundreds of years, the Jewish people kind of developed their own dialect for the language spoken, amongst the general population. So he wrote it in Arabic with Hebrew letters, and there were approved commentary, there were approved translations. There was a family, very famous family, that lived in Provence in southern France, the Ibn Tibon family, very famous family. You could Google them, and they were renowned translators of Arabic texts into Hebrew. And we have a series of letters between Maimonides and Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibon in France, where they were corresponding, and he would ask him, how do I translate this word? How do I translate this word? Like these words, and he was the official sanctioned translation. And today, when you open a book of Maimonides in his commentary on the Mishnah, you'll probably see the Hebrew translation of Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibon.
How do we get these documents? Who kept them? Yeah, that's from 1100 and 1200.
Yes, that's a good question. That's a good question. But there's many books that were written. For example, we'll talk a little bit later on that there were books written by Maimonides' son. He had one surviving son who wrote a very significant book, as we'll see later on. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but that was lost. That was lost because things had to be written by hand and copied. Even the Talmud was written by hand, and had to be copied. But the significant works, like the works of Maimonides, were so popular, and they were disseminated amongst the entire Jewish people that we have multiple extant copies. And we have copies even of Maimonides' own handwriting. The Cairo Geniza, if you've heard of it. Maimonides would end up in Cairo. Right now he's in Morocco. He'll end up in Cairo at the age of, I think, 24. He ends up in Cairo. And we found in the 20th century this massive shul in Cairo, and they had upstairs an enormous Geniza, and we found hundreds of documents of Maimonides himself.
A library.
What the Geniza is more is
Archive.
It's more of an archive. Yes, it's more of an archive.
And
Yes.
they found 900-year-old.
Yeah, incredible stuff. Yeah, Google it. Cairo
What,
Geniza.
papyrus?
No, I don't know what was written on. But papyrus or cloth, I don't know what it was written on exactly.
Something strong to be able to last that long.
Yeah, and it's always helpful to
Very dry.
Very dry,
and
yes.
It didn't
Yes.
disintegrate. Yeah.
Okay.
Not going from memory. He's literally sitting in a cave with 63 volumes
Oh,
of the Mishnah.
Maimonides, you read his stuff and you just hear about, well, this is just like the beginning of his like massive accomplishments. The man had a capacity, the intellectual capacity of who knows how many men. You know, it's incredible. It's incredible. And especially through, you know, his chaotic and we'll see tragic life as well. He wrote these words, and this is just the first of them. We'll see the next one is even greater, and it's I think it's undeniably his next work. We'll get to Mishnah Torah. His next work was also called the Archazaka, but a collection of Jewish law, a codification of Jewish law, which was, I think, I could safely say, the most significant and impactful and influential book since the Talmud. Now, the Talmud was written by a team of rabbis over 60 years. And Maimonides himself, who lived a very chaotic and very busy life. He was a physician as well, who was busy from morning to night, and he was able to write this this incredible work that has changed and altered Jewish history. That's how significant it was. Either way, we're on his Mishnah. We're on his commentary of the Mishnah. Another thing that was unique with regard to this book was that it was written not only as a commentary of the Mishnah, but also Maimonides gave you in the commentary at the end of every Mishnah, he gave you what the actual halacha was. Now the term halacha means practical application, practical observance of a particular law. So we can analyze a law from a theoretical or intellectual, analytical perspective, like an academic. Additionally, there's an additional level. Okay, fine, now you're Jewish. How do you actually apply this? What do you actually do? How do you actually observe this particular law in practice? So Maimonides was one of the first to actually include that in his commentary. Because the Mishnah itself does not have that. That comes from the Talmud, from the Gemara. So he weaved that into his commentary to give it more of a practical meaning for his readers. So you would read a particular Mishnah, he would explain, and at the end say, and actually what you do is such and such and such and such. Halacha. And this was going to be an ongoing or lifelong mission of Maimonides to teach halacha, practical Jewish law, to the Jewish people. And another innovation, as we mentioned earlier, was the idea of introductions. In this commentary on the Mishnah, Maimonides wrote 3 major introductions. An introduction to the Mishnah itself, in which he delineates the transmission of the oral Torah. He has a very long essay, enormously long essay, where he kind of teaches you what Torah is all about, what prophecy is about, in an amazing introduction to Torah. If you get a copy of it in English, I would highly advise that. We have his introduction to the Chapters of the Fathers. Chapter of the Fathers is the book of the Mishnah that deals with ethics. So he gives, it's called the Shmona Prakim. It in itself is his own book. It's called Maimonides' Introduction to the Chapters of the Fathers, which is about ethics and midos, and he describes the various components of the soul. He talks about what man's mission is in life. Very interesting, but also very hard to understand. Just to give that little caveat. Introduction and essay. And lastly, we have his introduction to the last chapter of Sanhedrin, in which it is a treatise on reward and punishment, heaven and hell, afterlife, Messiah, the world to come, all those things. A tremendous presentation of principles of Jewish philosophy. Right? There's not a short word, not a short. You think of introduction like short. It's more than 5,000 words, like 5,000. I counted the words. I did a word count on it. 5,600 words. It's enormous, and written in Hebrew. Hebrew always has less words than English, so think of it as it's enormous. And in there, he also writes the 13 principles of faith. 13 principles of faith. Famous Maimonides, 13 principles of faith. Now, this is a teenager. A teenager is publish it. Well, he actually published it when he arrived in Morocco at the age of 24. But a teenager is publishing, or someone who's quite young, quite a scholar, but still quite young, and he wrote what he said is this is what you have to believe in. You want to be Jewish? What does it mean? 13 things that are essences of the principles of faith. And this was enormously controversial. And we'll see with every one of Maimonides' great literary accomplishments, it always came together with some heavy dose of controversy. And the idea of assigning a moniker of principle to a certain belief or a certain law was almost unheard of till then. And there was a basic question. Wait a minute. Assuming we got the entire Torah from God, how could you say that this one is more important than this one? How can you say that this belief, this faith, this ideal, this mitzvah is more important than... How do you assign the term principle, right, as it being more essential than anything else? It's all the Word of God. So this was enormously controversial. There were rebuttals. There were books written, like a book called the Book of Principles, written by Rabbi Yosef Alba, who was also a great scholar and a contemporary, and he tried to refute the Rambam. And he said, no, there's not 13 principles, there's actually 3 principles. Those 3 principles are belief in God, belief in Torah, and belief in reward and punishment. And if you actually were to analyze Maimonides' 13 principles, you'll find that these 13 are really 5, 4, and 4. The first 5 are belief in God. The next 4 are belief in Torah. And the last 4 are belief in reward and punishment. So in essence, Rabbi Yosef Albo in his rebuttal to Maimonides is actually agreeing with Maimonides. That there's really 3 principles, but 3 principles that have multiple elements to a principle. For example, if I were to say, hey, you have to believe in God, that's a principle of Judaism. Well, what does that mean to believe in God? So Maimonides, number 1, says you have to believe in God. That's the first principle. Number 2, you have to believe that God is indivisible. Right? Part of having faith in God is believing that this God is something that's has no physicality, has no body, cannot be divided into parts. That's the Jewish definition of God. God's eternity. God alone is the subject of worship. In essence, those first 5 of the 13 principles of Maimonides are different elements of the same idea, belief in God. The next 4, God communicates with us. So there's the idea of prophecy. Number 2, the preeminence of Moses' prophecy. Moses' prophecy was different. Number 3, the Torah that we have today is the one dictated to Moses by God. And number 4, that the Torah is unchangeable, it's immutable. All those 4 are 4 elements, 4 components, 4 aspects of the idea of faith in God. And lastly, the last 4 are to believe in that God is aware of what we do. Hence, our actions have an impact. And there's reward and punishment. The idea of a Jewish Messiah, which is an element of reward and punishment. And the idea of resurrection of the dead, which is additionally an idea of reward and punishment. So those are the Maimonides' 13 principles of faith that he wrote as a youngster. It was a subject of great controversy, but ultimately, like all the controversies of Maimonides, he prevailed. And in every Jewish prayer book, we have the Ani Mamins, which is a shortened version of these 13 principles. And we also have the prayer of Yigdal. And Yigdal is a poetic way of saying these 13 principles. And Maimonides' 13 principles have been accepted pretty much as being the principles of the Jewish faith. Now, it's important to note that even though Maimonides' 13 principles of faith were contested by his peers and debated, even after his death they were debated, no one denied the validity of these ideas. No one said that, to be Jewish, you don't have to believe in any one of these things. They were just arguing on the fact that was it a principle or not? Was it a principle? Does it have superiority over any other idea? I mean, it's important to know when you hear, Maimonides' principles of faith was a subject of great debate, it's important to not make the mistake in thinking that the actual veracity of those statements was in debate. That was never a part of the debate. The debate was whether these true statements are principles or not. Either way, this was Maimonides' first major literary accomplishment, the commentary on the Mishnah, written in a way that people could understand it, written in Arabic, language of the land, written with halacha, written with the actual application of the law part of the commentary, and gives us what would end up being the backbone or the basis, the foundation of Jewish philosophy and theology that he did before he was 24. At the age of 24, Maimonides, the Rambam, by the way, is an acronym for Rabbi Moshe Ben Maimon. His father's name was Maimon. His name was Rabbi Moshe. So Rabbi Moshe Ben, the son of Maimon, RMBM is in Hebrew reads Rambam. This is called Rambam. Maimonides is a Latinization of his name, just like Nachmanides, which is Maimonides, the son of Maimon. So he arrived in Cairo at the age of 24, where he was to live the remaining of his life and last 45 years of his life.
Who was administering Egypt at the time?
Well, we'll get to that. The Sultan Saladin. We'll hear more about him because Rambam's going to have a very close relationship with him. So we'll hear more about that. So he arrived there at the age of 24, and he was going to live there to his death in the year 1204 at the age of 69, just short of his 70th birthday. And there happens to be a problem. 3 times in the Torah it says that you shouldn't go live in Egypt. And the Rambam lived in Egypt, lived in Cairo, more precisely in Fustat, which is a suburb of Cairo. So we have letters today. They found the letters in the Cairo Geniza. They found letters. Ani Moshe, he signed it. Ani Moshe Ben Maimon HaSephardi. I, Moses, son of Maimon from Spain. Sfarad is the Hebrew for Spain. Ha'over b'chol yom b'shlosho lavim. Who transgresses every day 3 prohibitions. These 3 prohibitions of not living in Egypt. Either way, there's a debate. Was he allowed to live there? They said that there was an argument that he tried to move to Israel, but Israel was in ruins from all the Crusades. Either way, he ended up in Egypt. That's where he lived for the rest of his life. Now, the one thing that everyone knew about the Rambam coming in here, that he was the epitome of a Renaissance man. He was a great philosopher whose philosophy is debated till now. He was a physician. He was an expert in poetry, mathematics, astronomy. He was a linguist. And of course, he was a halachist. Most of this was self-taught. When he arrived at Cairo, he began practicing medicine. Now, today, to become a doctor, you have to actually go to school for like 150 years, 12 years, whatever it is, in residency. But back in the ancient times, that wasn't like that.
So he was Jewish, so he became a doctor. Right?
So he became a doctor, and not only that, we actually have today. There's multiple books that we have today. His books on medicine. He wrote books, I guess, that were widely acclaimed books because they survived till now. We have his books on, but needless to say, his books on halacha outshine his books on medicine.
But did he get training from somebody else to become a philosopher, to become a medical scientist? Who was his role model? What?
I don't know exactly. We don't know much about his education. We do know that he was considered to be a great physician. He had a very great reputation. And speaking of the Sultan Saladin, Maimonides quickly became the official court physician for Saladin's ministers and his harem. And he had quite a large harem. And Maimonides was very busy tending to the medical needs at the palace. The king was quite fond of Maimonides, and he appointed him with the title of Nagid. Nagid is the official representative of the Jewish community to the palace. And we have lists of his diplomatic and political achievements that seem to have saved the Jews from a lot of... he had a lot of great success. He scored many concessions in favor of the Jewish people.
Oh, was Saladin a Turk?
I believe Saladin was in.
No, the Turks weren't there in the Middle East at the time. There was
Yeah.
still somewhere in Central Asia. But is it the same Saladin who was a sparring partner of King Richard, right?
That's right.
The same Saladin.
That's right. Yes. And you could. It's well known that Maimonides was here, the court physician, and we have a letter. We actually have a letter. Maimonides has a letter describing his typical day, and this letter, I'll read it to you. I'm reading. That's why I brought this here. The letter. He wrote this letter to. Remember, we had his original book, his first book, Commentary on the Mishnah, written in Arabic, but he sanctioned translations by the Ibn Tibbon family, who lived in France. So we have a dialogue between them because they would write letters. What does this mean? What does that mean? Rambam was a prolific writer of letters as well. And one time, Rabbi Ibn Tibbon writes a letter. I want to come visit you. So Maimonides writes to him in a letter, and he describes to him. He says, "If you come visit me, you won't be able to see me. I'm way too busy. And here's my day. And here's the letter. Ready? I selected parts of the letter because I don't want to, for brevity's sake. This is not my own translation, but this is the letter. It's just not. I can't vouch for the exact veracity of the translation. I'm sure it was written in Arabic as well, but this is a good translation. The Lord himself knows how I'm able to write this letter. He's like, I don't even know how I'm able to write this letter. That's how he starts off. I have to run away from people, isolate myself in a hidden place. Sometimes I have to lean against the wall, and at others I have to write lying down because I am so ill and weak. I am already coming to old age, but with respect to your wish to come visit me, I rejoice that you would like to come, and I long for your companionship. More than you are happy to see me, I would be happy to see you. Though it worries me that you would have to make the dangerous sea trip. This is what I told you. Maimonides seemed to have this phobia of travel because we know his brother died at sea. My advice is that you should not come. What advantage would you have in coming here, except that you would see me for a few minutes? If you want to have a private audience with me and discuss matters of wisdom, don't even hope for 1 hour during the day or the night. I will write you my daily schedule. Listen to this, guys. I live in Fustat, and the Sultan lives in Cairo. The distance between them is 4,000 cubits. Cubits is a Talmudical measurement. It's about 1.5 miles. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. I must see him every morning to check on his health. If one day he does not feel well, or one of the princes or the women of his harem doesn't feel well, I cannot leave Cairo that day. It often happens that there's an officer or two who needs me, and I have to attend to healing them all day. Therefore, as a rule, I am in Cairo early each day, and even if nothing unusual happens, by the time I come back to Fustat, half the day is gone. Under no circumstances do I come home earlier, and I am ravenously hungry by then. When I come home, my foyer is already full of people, Jews and non-Jews, important people and not, judges and policemen, people who love me and people who hate me, a mixture of people, all of whom have been waiting for me to come home. Imagine, he finishes his long day at work, comes home, this whole house is full of people. They're all sick. Right? If he's a famous doctor, as we mentioned. I get off my donkey, wash my hands, and go out to the hall to see them. I apologize and ask that they should be kind enough to give me a few minutes to eat. That is the only meal I eat every day. And then I go out to heal them, write them prescriptions and instructions for treating the problems. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes, I swear to you by the Torah, I'm not exaggerating, he says, it is 2 hours into the night before they are all gone. I talk to them and prescribe for them, even while lying down on my back from exhaustion. And when the night begins, I am so weak I cannot even talk anymore. Imagine? Because of all this, no Jew can come and speak to me in wisdom or have a private audience with me because I have no time except on Shabbos. On Shabbos, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of them, come to my house after morning services, and I teach the members of the community as to what they should do during the entire week. He would give a class. He said, this is the class for the whole week because I can't see you the rest of the week. We learn together in a week fashion until the afternoon. Then they all go home. Some of them come back, and I teach them deeply between the afternoon and evening prayers. That is my daily schedule. And I've only told you a little of what you would see if you would come. He's like, I'm toning it down, basically. That's his letter. And I think that this gives an insight, how busy this man was. And I think if you hear more about his accomplishments, it just makes it even that more mind-boggling.
How lasted 69?
And it just
ate one meal a day.
this is this is what he's writing on, and he's saying that this is just a little bit of what I have to do. Like, when did he study? When did he have time to write? We don't even know. Like, it's mind-boggling, the capacity of this individual. And my grandfather once said, he quoted from his Rebbe, he says that if the Gentiles had Maimonides, if he was one of theirs, they would immediately deify him. Right away. They would deify him. No question about it, they would deify him. Because this is just someone so mind-boggling, and for the Gentiles, like, to them, like, whoa, this like, anytime they see a human doing supernatural things, they're like, it's got to be a god, right?
Sure, he was one person.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Oh, we have all his contemporaries. It's right. Yes. Okay, so that's his life. That's his day, and we see some of his accomplishments. But now here comes the bomb, and this work that we're about to talk about. The next of his great works, called the Mishnah Torah. Now, I know it's confusing, because we have the Mishnah, which is written in circa 200, and he's writing a book called Mishnah Torah. The reason for that is because the word Mishnah means repetition. To repeat something, to do it again. And the Mishnah, was written in a way that could easily be repeated to memorize. Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah as a repetition of Torah. And we'll see what that means. This book was his magnum opus, and perhaps the magnum opus of the entire Jewish people. It's easily the most impactful book since the Talmud, the year 500. And it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary. And I want to give a little bit of background before I describe what this actual book is. You know, we talk about the Torah, what the Jews actually got. We know they got the written Torah, but they also got the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is not just the laws, but also the application of the laws. So the example that Maimonides himself gives, this is an example that I pulled from his works. He says that in the written Torah, it says that the holiday of Sukkot, we have to sit in a sukkah. See this sukkah out over here right now, just built. Right? It's a law of the Torah. Besukkot teshvu shivat yamim. It says the verse in the Torah, during the holiday of Sukkot, you should sit in the sukkah for 7 days. That's what it says in the Torah, the written Torah. Moses taught the Jews what that actually means. So, for example, he says this is obligatory for men only, not for women. If someone is sick, they're not obligated. If someone's a traveler, they're not obligated. What defines kosher schach? It has to have a cover. It has to have the foliage on top. What constitutes kosher schach? It has to be organic, but it cannot be anything that was used for any utensil, any garment. You have to eat there and sleep there and drink there, etc., etc. All the various aspects of a law that is hinted to in the Torah, in the written Torah, was actually transmitted orally to the entire Jewish people. There was a whole system in place to make sure it was done accurately. It's a topic for a different day, how it was actually transmitted accurately without any mistakes. But either way, the written Torah was an outline, but the actual law, the halacha, the application, was transmitted orally in a very sophisticated method to ensure that it was done so successfully without mistakes or disagreements. And that worked wonderfully for 1,500 years. 1,500 years later, about the year 200 of the Common Era, we meet an individual by the name of Rabbi Judah the Prince. You heard that term? Judah the Prince. And he is known by another name, Rebbe, which just means rabbi. And if you open up the Talmud, it says rabbi. Says, wait a minute, which rabbi are we talking about? It's referring to Rabbi Judah the Prince because he was accepted by the entire Jewish people as being just the rabbi because of what he did. And what he did, what he decided to do, was to write down the Mishnah. The Mishnah being the laws of the Torah. He transitioned the actual halacha from being entirely oral to being written down partially. Now, why did he do that? And how did he do that? I wanted to bring another quote here from Maimonides himself, who talks about Rabbi Judah the Prince and his efforts in writing down the Mishnah, what he tried to accomplish with doing that. Am I going a little too fast here? Everyone's good?
If he wrote it, is he taking dictation from somebody?
No. It was a collaboration of more than 1,000 rabbis over many, many years. Oh, well, he'll describe. We'll read Maimonides. Maimonides just gives a very good, very good description of what Rabbi Judah the Prince set out to accomplish and why. Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote the Mishnah. This is taken from the introduction of his Mishnah Torah, which is the book we're analyzing now. More precisely, the 14 books we're analyzing now. Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, repetition of Torah, otherwise known by its alternate name, Yad HaChazak, the mighty hand. And he writes, Rabbi Judah the Prince wrote the Mishnah. Okay? From the time of Moses until Rabbi Judah the Prince, no one had written a book from which the oral Torah was publicly taught. Rather, so 1,500 years no one wrote this book. Rather, in each generation, the head of the court or the prophet at the time wrote down for his private use notes on the traditions he had heard from his teachers, but he taught in public from memory. The Jewish law, the oral Torah, the application, the practical observance of what the written Torah hints at, was always done in an oral fashion. Now, why was it done orally? Because an oral tradition is much more fluid. There's inflection. If I were to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I did not hit my wife, what would you say? What does that mean?
Obviously you did.
No, if I said I did not hit my wife, it means I did not hit my wife, correct?
Why would you bring it up?
Well, okay, but that you're deducing already. But let's play a little game here. Let's play a little game here. If I said I did not hit my wife, what does it mean? It means
somebody else did.
No, not yet. I got to there. It means I did not hit my wife. Yeah. However, if I said I didn't hit my wife, it means what you said. Someone else did.
Yeah,
if I were to say I didn't hit my wife,
or maybe you did something else.
That
to your
means you
wife.
kicked her, or you.
And if I said I didn't hit my wife, what does that mean?
Hit somebody else.
Exactly. So I just gave you one sentence with the same words with 4 different meanings. Which is an example of what, when something is transmitted orally, there is room for inflection. There's room for insinuation. And it's a much more fluid method of transmission. And we have Torah. The Torah is the most essential piece of information that must be transmitted accurately. If it's not done accurately, we say the entire mission of humanity is at risk.
How did Jews ever keep it all together, for heaven's sakes? You couldn't sit there and orally teach all these people over here, for example, and ignore all this whole bunch out in the shit.
Yes, you're mentioning a good point, because you see a world where most Jews are not dedicating their lives to study. However, if all you guys were studying for 14 years at 18 hours a day and dedicating your intelligence to studying the oral Torah, you probably would get it, right? That was common practice. Plus, there was always a fail-safe called the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was centralized Jewish leadership where if there were to arise any disagreement or conflict in what the actual law would be, it would be mediated over there. Plus, we had prophets. We had Jewish people were living in unity. They lived all in Israel, pretty much. Eventually, they were living in, there were 2 centers. But so long as you have these fail-safes and you have people dedicating their lives to study, you have the possibility of ensuring its continuity with complete accuracy. And we don't have, there's no recording of any disagreement of any sort for thousands of years, more than 1,000 years. Because it was done so properly. It was set up in a way, this is an entire different class, but we can have this class. But how the Torah was set up to ensure it's being transmitted entirely accurately.
Plus, whenever they were in the desert for the 40 years, that's all they were.
Well, they had Moses there. They had Moses, and that's all they were doing, exactly. Yeah. And they also had Moses. And we know, we're going to read in a few weeks where Moses says at the end of his life, ask me any question. If there was any disagreement, they went to Moses. And then eventually to Joshua, and eventually to the judges like Samuel and Gideon and all these. They had great centralized Jewish leadership. Plus, they had a dedicated population, dedicated to study and immersion in study, not just study. Let's study on Sundays for an hour and a half. Or no, not to belittle what we're doing here, of course not. But much more of a dedication towards study and scholarship. And
who made the bread, the money to pay for these guys to sit here 18 hours
well,
a day?
Same as an Israel today, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's still like the Levites, you give them a donation for the first part of the.
Yeah, well,
But it's like in any community.
even
Who pays for the monks in Christianity? Right?
yeah, but also the
those
Jew.
studying-
This happens to be an issue of great debate because Maimonides takes in multiple places in his writing, takes a very strong stand against people studying Torah for a livelihood. Maimonides, I mentioned this in a different class. Maimonides writes, not over here, but Maimonides writes. He says, "Listen, people that are working, they absolutely should work. Don't make the Torah into a shovel to dig with or a crown to get glory from." He's very, very strong. Maimonides was almost a diatribe. We could read this in his commentary to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Chapters of the Fathers, "Don't make the Torah a shovel to dig with or a crown to get glory from." And Maimonides goes on a rant, diatribe against people that study Torah in exchange for money. And he brings examples. He goes on and on and on and on. And he repeats that again in Mishnah Torah. So he was clear not in the belief that people study Torah for payment. But he also writes, he says, listen, even people that are working, they should make their Torah pursuits the primary focus of their lives, and their professional pursuits should be secondary. Someone has 12 hours in the day to do things. Just 3 hours dedicated to Torah, dedicated to your livelihood, and the 9 hours dedicated to Torah. So he says, listen, yes, of course, everyone should work. He was of that opinion. But still, how do you abandon the Torah? 9 hours as a minimum, just for regular common folk. No, not for the scholars, not for this is for everyone. That's what he writes. He writes it in the laws of Torah. He writes that. So yes, even those that worked, there was in times and years bygone, there were, the Torah said, the Mishnah says, make your Torah pursuit the ikar, the primary focus, and everything else to be secondary. If there was that attitude, it's not so hard to see how. And between me and you, most people today don't really work more than 3 hours. Actual work. Actually, there was a study showing that the average person works, I think, 2 hours and 29 minutes. Actual work.
Do you think we only work 3 hours a day?
No, but actual work, not just like
Not just present.
kratzing around in the office or drinking coffee. Either way, topic for a different discussion, for a different day. So there was this amazing system of transmission of the Torah, and it was done actually successfully until the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince, when it was written down and it was codified and canonized. But before that, no one had actually done this work, final work that was taught publicly. Rather, each one had their individual notes, but publicly they taught orally from memory. Back to Maimonides' own work. So too, each individual wrote, according to his ability, parts of the explanation of the Torah and of its laws that he had heard, as well as the new matters that developed in each new generation, which had not been received by tradition, and had been deduced by applying 30 principles for interpreting the Torah, etc. Such has always been done until the time of Rabbi Judah the Prince. What did he do? He gathered together all the traditions, all the enactments, and all the explanations, and all the interpretations that have been heard from the times of Moses, our teacher, or have been deduced by the courts of all the generations and all matters of the Torah, and he wrote the book of the Mishnah from all of them. And he taught it in public. And it became known to all of Israel. Everyone wrote it down and taught it everywhere, so that the oral Torah would not be forgotten. This is an entire book, but really it's 63 books organized in 6 sections, which is all of Jewish law, written down and agreed upon and finalized and accepted by the entire Jewish people. Now, why did he do that? Why did Rabbi Judah the Prince do that? Why did he not leave it the way it was? What was wrong with it till then? Because he saw that the students were becoming fewer and fewer. Calamities were continually happening. Remember, the Romans started enacting restrictions on Torah study, public Torah study. Wicked government was extending its domain and increasing its power, and the Israelites were wandering and reaching remote places. Right, the decentralization of the Jewish community was a tremendous detriment to continually teaching Torah in an old fashion. And he thus wrote a work to serve as a handbook for all, so that it could be rapidly studied and would not be forgotten throughout his life. And he and his court continued giving public instructions of the Mishnah. This was groundbreaking. This was a finalized, authoritative text that would incorporate all of Jewish law. 63 books, broken up to 523, I think, chapters, and it covers everything. Everything of Jewish law. Now, this was a very terse, very succinct, very brief Jewish hand. It was like kind of a handbook. And it was called Mishnah because the idea was to repeat it and to memorize it. And still today, I have a nephew who lives in Israel, and they memorize vast amounts of Mishnah. They know these kids are 9 years old in Israel, and they know tens of books of Mishnah by heart. You say, okay, tractate Shabbos, Book of Shabbos. Right? There's a book called Book of Shabbos. Chapter 14. Boom! He starts reading. Reads it all in Hebrew. Right? Till this day, there are people that are memorizing the Mishnah. Right? And while it was a written document of Jewish law, it didn't actually give you halacha. Halacha is the holy grail, so to speak, of Jewish law because it's the actual practical application. It's all the various manifestations of a certain law. It's the exceptions, it's the sources, it's the understanding, it's the interpretation, it's everything else. That wasn't included in the Mishnah. That was retained in its oral fashion. What Rabbi Judah the Prince did was save the Jewish people from having them forget the Torah. However, he did only what was necessary in taking the oral Torah and writing it down. He only wrote down the actual crude, so to speak, laws. It's written very briefly, and the rest of the actual law, that was still maintained in its oral fashion. Right? Because he wanted to minimize this decision that he made. Now, because there were still vast sums of the oral Torah that was transmitted orally, there came a point in time where even that cannot be maintained, and hence we have 300 years later, roughly, this is all rough, about the year 500, we have the Talmud being written down. Now, the Talmud is an enormous expansion of the effort began by Rabbi Judah the Prince. It took the laws and expanded them. It expanded and expounded upon them. You might have 4 lines of Mishnah and 178 lines of Talmud. Right? It's hundreds and hundreds and thousands of very large documents. And today's print will have 2,711 pages. Each one of these pages is tremendously dense. You could spend months on a single page. The greatest scholars most of them can't do more than a page in a day. You know, it's an enormous amount of information. But what it is it takes this law of the Mishnah and gives us all the background information. It gives us the sources. It gives the applications. It gives us the exceptions. It gives us everything else we need to know about a certain law. And it's it is very meandering. It doesn't stick to the topic. It might say, we're talking about something, we're trying to prove something, we're trying to analyze something, and we're bringing something else, and we just go off on a tangent. And 3 pages later, we'll get back to our original discussion.
Simplicity is genius.
Yes.
What in the world can we do?
Simplicity is genius, and you're asking the question.
The question is, what book already?
What?
Shulchan Aruch.
Well, so listen to what Maimonides writes. He says, listen, the Talmud, enormous scholarship, what it did is it gave us everything we need to know. However, it's very hard to find it. If you want to actually know what you need to do, it's all there. It's all there. But you have to be a tremendous scholar to even learn it once, much less to actually remember it.
Or go with the shovel.
Go with the shovel, yeah. And he writes, says, listen, it's not user-friendly for the common folk. If you want to know what to do, halacha, it's in the Talmud. Go find it. It's a needle in Houston. Right? It's a needle in 500 haystacks. Right?
They don't have a table of contents.
Well,
now they do.
Well, yes, and it is organized by subject, but oftentimes it goes on to a different subject. And over time, a single subject could be spread out into 4 different books. And you won't even know where to find it, unless you're a tremendous scholar. You know, you have topics that are discussed in multiple places in the Talmud, sometimes 10 or 12 places. And to actually know what to do, you have to collect all of them, analyze each one of them individually, compare and contrast them, understand what the context of each one of them is. Right? Tremendous scholar, not for the common folk. This is where Maimonides comes in.
Did you have to do that?
Me?
Yeah.
What are we talking about me?
I don't know. Studying to be
Yeah, well,
such
that's
a
well.
scholar,
Today,
and
it's
is that
this.
something that rabbis? I'm sorry, I'm
Today,
I'm
absolutely,
digressing.
absolutely, no, absolutely. Today, people do that. They spend people in yeshiva. What they actually do is they study Talmud and they study Maimonides. But what's Maimonides? How does Maimonides fit into this? We have the Mishnah written down. We have the Talmud written down. Everything's there. Very hard to find it. Let's see what he writes. The subject matter of the Talmud is back to the words of Maimonides in his introduction. Is interpretation of the text of the Mishnah and explanation of its depths and the matters that developed in various courses from the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince till the writing of the Talmud. If you were to take the Talmud and the Tosefta and the Sifra and the Sifri and the Toseftot, which is other books which are contemporary, from all of them, from this enormous amount of data and information, are to be found what is forbidden and what is permitted, what is clean, what is unclean, what is liable, what is exempt, what is fit for use, what is unfit for use, according to an unbroken oral tradition from the times of Moses at Sinai. It's all there. You take the Talmud, both Talmuds, there's a Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, the Sifra, the Sifri, the Toseftas, the Mechiltas, all these books that are contemporary to the Talmud, if you take all of them, you know what the actual will do. You know practical halacha. What do I do? I'm Jewish. What does it mean? It's there, but where do I find it? Is it here? Is it there? Is it there? Well, how do I assemble all this information? How do I organize it? How do I make it practical? Continues Maimonides. After they wrote the Talmud, the people of Israel were scattered throughout the nations, most exceedingly, and reached the most remote parts and distant islands, and armed struggle became prevalent in the world, and the public ways became clogged with armies. There became a lack of interaction and dialogue and interface amongst the various Jewish communities. Jewish people are spread out. They're under exile and turmoil. Inquisition, we have very challenging times for the Jewish people. The study of Torah, as a result of that, declined. And the people of Israel ceased to gather in places of study in their thousands and myriads as they had before. Rather, they gathered together as only a few individuals in each town and each city and occupy themselves with the Torah. The Talmud is an amazing book and very useful if you're a tremendous scholar. And for years, hundreds of years even, there were tremendous scholars and they were studying Torah, multitudes, and people were able to use the Talmud for practical law. However, writes Maimonides, during our times, it's no longer possible. And only the sages, only those individuals know who have the time, the dedication, the wherewithal to study all the Talmud, only they actually know what to do with it. He writes again, in our time, severe troubles come one after another, and all are in distress. The wisdom of our sages has disappeared, understanding of the discernment is hidden. Thus, what had seemed clear have in our times become hard to understand, so that only a few properly understand them. And the study of the Talmud requires a broad mind, a wise soul, considerable time before one can correctly know from them what is forbidden or permitted and other rules of the Torah. So we have a problem. We have enormous amounts of information that is not organized in a way for it to be simple to understand for the common folk. You have to be a tremendous scholar who dedicates your life to study and scholarship, and then you'll know what to actually do from the Talmud. But most people aren't doing that. For this reason, I, Moshe, the son of Maimon, the Sephardi from Spain, I found that the current situation is untenable, unbearable. So, relying on the help of Hashem, blessed be He, I intently studied all of these books, and I wrote I wrote very clearly what is forbidden, what is permitted, what is clean, and what is unclean, and all the other rules of the Torah. Everything in clear and precise language and style, so that the whole oral Torah would become thoroughly known to all, without bringing any problems or solutions or different points of view, rather clear, convincing, and correct statements in accordance with a law drawn from all these words and commentaries that have appeared from the times of Rabbi Judah the Prince to the present. This is so that all the rules should be accessible to the small and to the great, like you mentioned, in the rules of each and every commandment and the rules of the legislation of the sages and prophets. In short, so that a person, listen to this, guys, listen to this. In short, so that a person should need no other book in the world. Just this one. A work that would collect all of the oral Torah, including the positive and negative laws, the customs, negative legislations, enacted from the times of Moses till today. And thus I have called this work the Mishnah Torah, a restatement of the Torah. Listen to this. For a person reads the written Torah first, and then reads this book, and he knows the entire oral Torah without needing to read any other book besides for them. That's what he set out to write. I am going to collect, to organize, to codify all of this Talmud, all of the Mishnah, and organize it in a way that's simple for the simple people and for the great people.
How big is this book, the Mishnah Torah?
Okay, let's get to this Mishnah Torah. So this is the encyclopedia of Jewish life, Jewish practice, Jewish philosophy, Jewish belief, Jewish custom, Jewish everything. A to Z. Organized to perfection. 14 volumes, divided into sections, divided into subsections, divided into paragraphs and sub-paragraphs. Organized to such detail that later people would analyze it and would say that we can deduce what Maimonides means from where he placed a certain law. His contemporaries wrote that we have to analyze the Rambam's work so critically that as if it was a Mishnah, as if it was the Mishnah which was written 1,000 years earlier by a collaboration of 1,000 rabbis. Maimonides' works. Later commentaries, when they were to quote him, says, these are the works of Maimonides, who writes with his golden tongue. It's beautifully written, amazingly written. And he's going to collect everything. All the laws of marriage, laws of divorce, laws of Torah, the laws of everything. 14 books, each one of them divided into sections, subsections, paragraphs, subparagraphs. Incredible. An incredible piece of scholarship. And not only is it a piece of scholarship, but it was fundamental in taking the Torah, which was in a very disparate fashion, very obscure sometimes, very hard to understand, hard to actually apply, and make it simple, readable, understandable for everyone.
And how was it circulated to everyone before, printing?
We know, it's a good question. We know that this was a very controversial book. Like all Maimonides, all the great innovations that have ever happened have been controversial. But it was widely disseminated. Like all Maimonides' works, widely disseminated. In fact, we know how much so because after his life, many of his works were so controversial, even Jews that went against it. And we have book burnings. Maimonides' own books, even by some Jews, eventually by the non-Jews. King Louis the Ninth in France. There were those the people they told him, hey, listen, Maimonides' Guide to Perplex, which is the next of his great accomplishments, it contains anti-Christian information. He says, oh, really? And they gathered all copies of the Guide to Perplex and burned them. And eventually, at that very same spot, soon after, in the year 1242, this is already almost 50 years after Maimonides dies, they burned every single extant copy of the Talmud in France, which was considered a sign by his detractors that if you're going to burn the book of Maimonides, eventually the Talmud itself will be burned. And after 50 years after Maimonides' death, he already became infallible. His detractors just seized. And in fact, we have Rabbeinu Yonah, one of his contemporaries, who was at one point a detractor of the Rambam. He wrote the book called Shari Tshuva, Dates of Repentance, to repent for his own going against Maimonides, for his own rejection of Maimonides. Either way, it was widely disseminated.
But the Rambam has them make another copy every time you want to distribute a book, right?
Well, it was taught by other people.
Okay.
So he wrote it, and it was widely disseminated. Maimonides' works reached everywhere.
So because Jews, by definition, the percentage of literates is so high.
Yeah, it was 100%,
So
almost 100%.
Yeah, so it's much easier to make copies. There are many more people available to make those those copies and disseminate them to the community, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So how much time did it take him to write this book?
We don't know exactly. The best, I think there is some indication that it was 10 years. Some argue it was maybe 13 years in total isolation. Total isolation.
So was it
But
after he was
So
a doctor?
this it was either after or before. I'm not so clear exactly. We don't know the exact dates of when he wrote it. We know that he wrote it during his middle life. I think he finished it maybe when he was 60, but he was also constantly updating it.
But he was still working as a palace doctor.
It seems like it, yes.
So it's not total isolation.
Well, it seemed that he might have started it beforehand, but it was an ongoing work. It wasn't like it was a set.
Then why did you say he wrote it in total isolation?
Because that's what I heard. I don't know for sure. I haven't seen this documented. But in my research, someone wrote that he wrote it in isolation, but either he wrote the bulk of it before he became a doctor, or he wasn't yet working, or he took a hiatus. I don't know exactly. I mean, he took a sabbatical. I don't know.
Maybe total isolation means total isolation.
Maybe it was at
As a-
nights.
as a
Maybe
scholarship.
yes. Maybe it wasn't total isolation entirely. Yes. I don't know. These are the. I'm sure there's someone's written something about it, some sort of analysis on it. Exactly. So this book, Mishnah Torah, otherwise known as Yad HaChazaka, its impact cannot be understated. It's certainly the most impactful book that the Jewish people have seen since the times of the Talmud. Not only in its scope and its breadth, but also in what it enabled us to do as a people. Like, it made Judaism user friendly. It made Judaism user friendly, and it was widely disseminated. And its format and its structure is also something which we haven't seen till then, and we haven't seen even since then. During Maimonides' time, within the 500 year time period, we have other people that attempted to do the same thing. Most primary amongst them is the Tour, who lived in France, son of the Rush, Rabbi Yechiel ben Asher.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the order of how does it start? Like his 14 books with sections and subsections. Like, what's the order? How is it? What's the format? So we have others of his contemporaries that wrote in the format of, let's say, the beginning of the day. So we have the Tour, for example, wrote his book of laws, his collection of the Talmud, his kind of copy of Maimonides. He wrote it in the order of the day. So he starts off with what's the law of waking up in the morning, and what's the law of prayers in the morning, and then what's the laws of eating, because you eat after you pray, and then what's the laws of the day, and what's the laws of the week, and what's the laws of the year. That was his format. We have others that wrote in the order of the Talmud, so they wrote alongside the Talmud, which, if Maimonides were to do that, would probably not accomplish as much as he did, because he specifically was trying to come up with a new way of organizing, because the Talmud could be very disparate. It could be very spread out. It's not really unified in topic. What Maimonides chose to do was write it in order of importance. Most important thing first, next most important thing, next important thing, all the way to the least most important thing at the end. Which is remarkable because he's kind of telling you what he thinks is the most important. So, for example, the first book of these 14 books is called the Book of Knowledge. In it contains 5 sections. Section number 1, the laws of the foundations of Torah. What does it mean? What is Torah all about? What is Judaism all about? The laws of precepts, which is his book on character, on behavior, on ethics, midos. The laws of study of Torah. The laws of idolatry and Gentile practices. And finally, the laws of repentance. These 5 sections comprise the first book called the Book of Mada, the Book of Knowledge. This was very controversial. It was along with Maimonides' philosophical work, The Guide to the Perplexed, it was also burned. But he does things in there that no one has ever seen before. Like, he's analyzing some of the philosophical problems, for example, that we have in Judaism. Like, he's one who he asked the question, wait a minute, if we believe in an infinite God who's not bound by time or space, whose knowledge is not limited in any way, and he exists in the future as much as he exists in the past, how do we have free will? Which is a very famous problem, but one that not many others would even open up that kind of worms. Like, because that's major philosophical problem with our definition of God is that, and our reliance on free will as a basic mechanism for the engine of humanity, where they seem to be opposites. They seem to not be able to coexist. They seem to be mutually exclusive. Like, this is a problem that he would approach, and this was very controversial. Another major controversy of the Mishnah Torah was that it was a law book that didn't contain sources. Maimonides did not contain any sources, aside from just verses in the Torah. Maimonides is setting out to take the Talmud and organize it, and just take all the various aspects of the Talmud and pull from here, pull from there, and bring in one organized fashion. In some places it's easier. Like something, you have a book of Shabbos. There's a book in the Talmud called Shabbos. So half the work was already done in finding all the information, right? So when Maimonides has his book on, or his section called the Laws of Shabbos, there's one central place that he's going to pull most of it, and he'll get other stuff from elsewhere. But the laws of repentance, there's no one place in the Talmud that has laws of repentance. There's no book in the Talmud. None of the 63 books of the Talmud is a book of repentance. He pulled from here, pulled from there. It's remarkable how he's able to collect and organize and codify these laws, where he just pulls them from an enormous amount of information and organizes it in a clear, coherent, cogent manner. But he didn't write any sources. And can you imagine a law book, which he set out to be the authoritative law book for all the Jewish people, but doesn't tell you where he got any of it. There's this story, there's a letter that he writes that there was this rabbi from Baghdad came to visit him, brought him a certain law and says, where is this law? Where is it in the Talmud? Somebody's thinking, he says, I think it's in Tractate Sanhedrin. So they brought a Sanhedrin, and he looked from beginning to end, and says, he couldn't find it. He says, if it's not Sanhedrin, it must be Tractate Makros. And they looked through Tractate Makros, and they couldn't find it. So the guy left. He said, we don't know what the source is. And then Maimonides writes, after he left, I remembered it was in Tractate Yevamos, a third tractate, in a third book of the Talmud. And he sent a messenger, they chased after the guy until they told him where the source was. And then Maimonides says, and then I regretted not writing sources. And as we mentioned earlier, his son, Rabbi Avram ben Rambam, the son of the Rambam, was called Rabbi Avraham. He indeed wrote that book, but it was lost. We don't have that. We don't have a copy of that book. We have references to it in other books.
Book of references.
A book of references, exactly. But we don't have the actual book. And today, like I have written many, many essays on Maimonides, and the first basic question is, you say, fine, Maimonides has a law, where does it come from? Because he doesn't tell you his process. He doesn't tell you how he got to where he got. He just gives you his conclusion. You have to fill in the blanks yourself. And oftentimes you'll find a piece of Maimonides that says a law and presents it in a certain fashion, and you open up the corresponding piece of Talmud and you read it, and it seems to say the opposite. So there's some indication somewhere in the Talmud, that either this way we're reading the Talmud is wrong, or there's some other source that says the opposite, that Maimonides somehow prefers to go with the other source. You have to kind of retrace the steps, and you have no idea how you got there.
So post-Maimonides scholarship, in case of a conflict between Talmud, or visible conflict with Maimonides.
Yes, or sometimes Maimonides will contradict himself.
Yeah, it goes with Maimonides.
Yes. Oh, no. Maimonides has to fit into the Talmud. So you might have an ongoing question. I see the Maimonides, I see a piece of Talmud, I have no idea how these two things could possibly coexist. And I myself, I wrote an amazing article when I was in yeshiva. I was like 23 years old. I can show it to you guys in Hebrew. But I take it's very short also. I take a piece of Talmud. The Talmud is talking about a Jewish slave who wants to redeem himself, whether he could do a partial redemption. So he's, let's say, a slave for 6 years. He stole or he robbed or whatever. He arbitrarily chose to become a slave. Now he gets some money. Could he do it partially or not? It's a particular law in the Tractate Kiddushin. I don't remember the exact context of what the Talmud says. You open up Maimonides, and you look at all the commentators and say, wait a minute, this doesn't seem to fit in. the Talmud says this, and he says it's the opposite. And as people say, listen, I have no idea where he got it from. In commentaries, on the page, I have no idea where it came from. So I wrote an essay, and I proved in an ingenious way, if I may say so myself, how Maimonides was working behind the scenes based upon a certain source elsewhere in the Talmud that indicates one thing, and how that course and how a certain disagreement is part of the Talmud mirrors a disagreement that we have elsewhere, and how incredibly Maimonides could just throw something out and at surface level is just completely not understandable, but deep behind the scenes, this is my contribution to scholarship. But what he actually means and how he got there. So part of the appeal of the study of Maimonides is the unknown, and the room for later scholars to kind of give in their own input and their own analysis and scholarship. We read the introduction. Maimonides says, listen, all you need is my book and this book. All you need. All you need is the written Torah and my book. He set out to write the book to end all books. And ironically, no other book in history has spawned as many other books written upon it. Since its publication in the late 12th century, we have more than 10,000 volumes written upon it, with hundreds written every single year. Myself, I have hundreds of pages of essays and analysis on Maimonides' works. It's incredible. It's like the peak scholarship for us today is Maimonides, because oftentimes the problem is very evident and the solution is very hidden. Because he says, you read the Maimonides, you read the Talmud, you study all the Talmud, and Maimonides is on his own. He's on his own. He's on an island. All the other contemporaries says, where did he get this from? Where does this come from? What's going on over here? And your job is just, what was he thinking? This is a man, as we know, a man who was not, he didn't forget any piece of Talmud, that's for sure. A man of tremendous intelligence that would just be mind-boggling for us. Way beyond our capacity, and he wrote this. And he revised it and edited it and ensured this is it. It wasn't a mistake. It was an ongoing process for years. What does he mean? Where is he coming from? Where's his source? And there's hundreds, if not probably thousands of examples of these kind of quandaries in the study of Maimonides. Like we said, but his son did set out to write that book. We don't have that book, but we do have other books. Like commentaries, the first thing that most commentaries of Maimonides will say, at least the earlier commentaries, will say the Rambam source is from X. Either it's a Tosefta, a Talmud, a Mishnah. Usually it's fairly clear. But oftentimes we have major problems, and that's where a lot of scholarship is developed to try to understand where he's coming from. Now, the work of the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, was accepted by all as a standard bearer for halacha, as I wouldn't say the authoritative code on Jewish halacha, but significantly the most significant work of Jewish halacha. It is, Maimonides is viewed by all as the greatest codifier we've had of Jewish halacha. He wasn't the only one to attempt to do that. In later years, we have other people that attempted to do that, and he wasn't what he envisioned that he would end up being the authoritative work on Jewish law. There's many areas where he's alone, and therefore the Shulchan Aruch that was mentioned earlier by Bernie was a similar work done many hundreds of years later, where Rabbi Joseph Cairo collected all of the Rishonim, not only Maimonides, but also all of his contemporaries, and together with the Talmud tried to come up with the authoritative act, the work of Jewish law, which we have today as the Shulchan Aruch, which is the set table, codified Jewish law. But Maimonides' status as the greatest codifier is unquestioned, it's uncontested, and this particular set of books, the Yad HaChazaka, the Mishnah Torah, as the most significant book of Jewish code, of his time. That was his second major literary accomplishment. And lastly, a book that is widely studied even to this day, even though it's dealing with somewhat of an extinct philosophy, we have Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, Moreh Nevuchim, which is even today a basic textbook for philosophy. Maimonides as a philosopher studied by non-Jews as Jews as well. And what it is an attempt to portray Judaism with the framework of an Aristotelian philosophy. Aristotle was, even though 2,400 years ago is when he lived, but his philosophy was unquestioned. His framework, the framework of physics and just life, and philosophy, was what was the prevalent way of thinking up to the time of Maimonides. It isn't now anymore. But the Moreh Nevuchim, or Guide to the Perplexed, is a presentation of Judaism in that world, through those lenses. And as you may, as we could fairly assume, if you're going to write a book of Jewish philosophy and Jewish life and practice through a certain perspective of Greek philosophy, it's going to be very controversial. This would be Maimonides' most controversial work. It will be banned and burned. But today, it's still considered as a standard bearer of Jewish philosophy. Not quite with the same level as Maimonides' other book. It was written in Arabic, and it was almost, we could safely say, it was written for his generation. Today, no one's into Aristotelian philosophy.
So
right?
it's more like an intellectual exercise for today.
Well, for today, it's more academic.
It's viewed like,
yes, but in his time, it was an attempt to show Jewish thinkers how their Weltanschauung, their way of life, their worldview, fit in with the overarching, general, greater perspective on philosophy of the non-Jews. It would be the example of taking modern-day philosophy and modern-day social attitudes and showing Judaism in that. Like if I show Judaism today to contemporaries, to people today, you want to show them how Judaism fits in with an existing way of understanding the world. So you might show that, for example, Jewish people, the Jewish way of life has always been to put a premium on justice, tolerance, on like we mentioned last time when I was here about the Jewish way of warfare. It was unprecedented in its time, but today people understand that. Minimizing civilian casualties. That was a Jewish idea 3,000 years ago, and today we all know that intimately. That was kind of the idea of taking Judaism and presenting it in a way, or in a fashion, a framework where the people's way of thinking in Aristotelian philosophy, how that fits and how the interplay of that with the Jewish with Judaism. Maimonides lived a chaotic and tragic life. His first wife died, along with 2 children that did not survive to adulthood. His brother, as we mentioned, his brother David, who was very close to, very beloved to, was also a financial backer of Maimonides and his projects. He died at sea. He's a renowned merchant and businessman. These deaths were tremendously impactful to Maimonides as an individual. He would eventually remarry. He had a son, as we mentioned, Rabbi Avram. But he was exiled multiple times. He lived in multiple different places, lived a life of great personal turmoil. And yet, and he writes at the introduction of Mishnah, he says, he writes, for example, I pulled a quote here. He says, God knows, God can be my witness that there are laws that I wrote in middle of transit, in a caravan in transit, or I wrote them while I was at sea, on a boat in travel. He's saying he lived a life under duress, and that once again should magnify his accomplishments and his impact and influence into what he was, what he achieved and what he did for the Jewish people.
How could he have a life? I mean, I know that he didn't have a life other than his writing, his intellectual thing. If he had one wife and he said that he had 2 children, they died, and then he got married again, he had another wife. Does it talk about anywhere his relationship within his family? You know, we talk about Judaism
those
as a
things
very
out.
important part of family life.
Yeah, we could talk about that. I mean, we see that from his letters. You know, he was someone who was selfless.
I mean,
There's
how
no
could
greater
he suffer
self.
his
We
children?
read that letter. Well, his child was his disciple. You know.
So he only ends up with one child.
Yes,
That's
yes,
so
and
right.
there's till this day there's several thousand families that point to there. I had a friend in Israel whose last name was Rambam, because he was a direct descendant of the Rambam. That's a matter of great pride. I want to end with Maimonides' his death and his burial. Is somewhat of a legend how he ended up in Israel, but he's buried in Israel, even though he never lived in Israel during his life. But he ended up in Israel, so there's some legends about that. I don't want to talk about that too much. But on his grave in Tiberias, we have 2 very unique inscriptions. On one side it says, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam Moshe. From Moshe, from the times of our great teacher Moses, until Moshe, until Maimonides, there was no one like Moshe. His impact, at least the epithet on his grave said, his impact rivaled that of Moses, and he had no peers from the time of Moses. Think about what a statement that is. that was written about him. On the other side of the grave, it says Hamuvchar Hamin Ha'enoshi, which means the choicest, the prize of the human race. And a great scholar of this past 100 years was asked, why would such a description be written on the Rambam? Hamuvchar Hamin Ha'enoshi, the prize, the choicest of the human creed, of the humankind, the human species. So he said very interestingly, he says the word min has multiple meanings. It means on one hand a species, on the other hand it means also a heretic, a heathen. So he said, one of Maimonides' detractors, as we know, he was very controversial, especially after he died. There was an explosion of controversy in his life, in who he was, and his writings. There were some people that said he was a heathen. He was a min. So the guy came and wrote on his grave, Hamin, the heathen. And then someone else wrote, Hamuvchar, Hamin ha'enoshi, who added on those 2 words to say that this was, to just kind of masked the intention of the original graffiti artist on Maimonides' grave. So I think we got somewhat of an insight into who he was, what his accomplishments were, what were his contributions and accomplishments, his literary contributions and accomplishments that guide us to this day. You know, when you think of philosophy, first thing you personally think of Maimonides. When you have a question to a problem, right? When you want to analyze or try to take out the conclusions of a Talmud, and it's also the backbone of our halacha that we have today. We are grateful that we have had someone like Maimonides. Who knows what the Jewish people would look like if we didn't have him in our midst? Thank you. Thanks.
We get it on Amazon.
Can we get one on Amazon?
His book.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.